Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. So today I'll be covering a game called The Bouncer from 2000 by the company then known as Squaresoft. I never had this one as a kid, but I do remember seeing it advertised as a new PS2 game in the early 2000s, and I remember thinking the graphics looked incredible. The game starts off with a shot of a news report showing the development of a new solar-powered satellite. After the camera pans out from the TV, an ominous-looking lady with a really wide laptop is seen surveying a young girl wearing a yellow coat, about 4 sizes too big for her. This is then followed by a scene where a number of guys jump out of a helicopter who appear to be looking for this girl. The seeming leader of this group zones in on the girl and proceeds to defy the laws of gravity with his friends in pursuit of her. The girl, whose name is Dominique, appears at a bar called Fate, where she speaks to Zell-dinched evil-looking twin Volt, who for no apparent reason has a No Cactars logo on his jacket. Dominique speaks to the bar's landlord, who looks remarkably like Crichton from Red Dwarf, and pops upstairs to speak with Sion and Co, who along with Volt from before are the bar's resident bouncers. After a little bit of banter, the souped-up parkour experts from earlier break in and fight the main crew, and unsurprisingly kidnap Dominique. Turns out that they have come from Mikado Corporation, who are the developers of the satellite from the opening cutscene. The gang decides to go after Dominique by heading for Mikado and end up rushing onto a train. Of course, instead of actually going inside the train, they decide to jump on it at the last minute and then stand on the roof because, I don't know, it's cool. On the train, the gang are confronted by Echidna, fantastically voiced by Mary Elizabeth McGlynn.
If you don't have a ticket, you're gonna have to pay. And this ride ain't cheap.
Who is an assassin from Mikado who somehow knows Volt. After you kick her ass, she jumps off the train and is attacked by... I literally don't know. After the gang tries to stop the train, it crashes and burns in a spectacularly epic fashion. The gang escape this unscathed, because of course they do, and then carry on to the Mikado building. After traversing the building, they end up flying up a platform to the top of it and spot Dominique without her big yellow coat on, in which looks like the set from the end level of the Crystal Maze on steroids. The gang land in a nearby forest area, I'm not making this up, and are attacked by the ninja dudes again and give them a kicking. For some reason, the scene pans to a woman playing the piano who decides to go all Michael Jackson and transform into a panther. Wong, Sion's old master, and Big Bad Duragun are both in the dome too and are discussing whether they should move the sleeping Dominique into the Gallios, which is a rocket or ship or some kind of spacecraft. Apparently Duragun is actually Dominique's brother, and he fights the gang with Michael Jackson and you fall through an impossible floor. The game's animation budget then seemingly runs out, and we're given Duragun's backstory. He and Dominique were orphans and taken in by the head of the Mikado Corporation, as a hospital refused to take the sickly Dominique in. The head of the corporation then eventually dies and leaves his business to Duragun. Deep and meaningful storytelling. After the gang escape their fate, they end up rescuing Dominique, and then a member of your choice escorts Dominique through some boring warehouse stairs fighting some robots. The gang then come into contact with a cyborg cross between Sephiroth and Ivy from Soul Calibur, who actually sounds like him from the Powerpuff Girls.
You have much to learn, my lady.
And then give it a beatdown. After some more identical cyborgs turn up, Dominique transforms from stereotypically scantily clad damsel in distress into River Tam from Serenity. It turns out that Dominique is a cyborg too. Yep, good development there. The next section makes absolutely no sense, as apparently Volt used to know Duragun's adoptive father Mikado, and Duragun has invested his father's fortune in turning his dead sister into a cyborg.
You're lying!
Apparently she's also a component in the satellite launch too, which gives me Melfina from Outlaw Star vibes. Echidna then shows up and the gang kick her ass again, and the Gallios is launched. They decide to follow it on a floating platform, and are then attacked by the angry ninja parkour man from earlier in the game. This guy is kicked off the platform when beaten and dies in the most awesome way possible. After this, the game cuts to Duragun, who uses his satellite, which is also a super laser, to blow up the hospital that refused to take him and his sister and his kids. The gang then face Duragon, who has 2 phases. After you beat his first phase, he gets really serious and decides that taking his jacket off is the best way to power up. After this proves futile, Duragon is defeated, but the gang are doomed to crash into the satellite. This is of course until Dominic somehow remembers that the lower half of the ship can be ejected from the rest of it, and they return safely to the planet. After this, a dead Duragon is seen floating in space, and Echidna turns up at the bar to seemingly join the Bouncer crew. Now, we'll get back to this bonkers storyline in a bit after I've spoken about the gameplay. So it's pretty bad. You can either play as Volt, Sion or Ko, who are all handled very differently. I chose Volt for my playthrough because he had the highest health stat and I think actually handled the best. The game seems to model itself on old side-scroll beat-em-ups like Streets of Rage, but the massive problem here is that the screen doesn't scroll, and more often than not you're stuck in a small area. As with these old school beat-em-ups, the enemies and players tend to fall down when hit once, which results in you spending most of your time on the floor. I say most of your time very liberally, because once you manage to get a few hits in, pretty much all the stages in the game last about a minute at most. If you die in a stage, then there are no retries and it's game over. You're sent back to the title screen, where you have to reload your game. I was lured into a false sense of security when playing this game because it starts off very easy, and as said before, the stages are very short. Because of this, I didn't think it was necessary to save the game, because why would I want to spend even more time in the menu? I got about 5 or 6 stages in when I was confronted by Echidna on top of the train, and then died to her Eddie Gordo style unfair attack patterns. After spending the next 10 minutes skipping the cutscenes to get back to this point, I made sure to save at every single opportunity the game gave me. Every so often in this game you are confronted with a big boss battle, which really isn't that much different than every other enemy you fight. While the soundtrack is pretty good, the musical direction is pretty beige, as the music doesn't seem to match the urgency of what's going on screen. Stages of fighting are sometimes broken up with walking or exploring sections, including the most unfair death ever when trying to get into the Mikado facility as these doors come down. Unless you're quick enough to realise the game is positioned you to be stuck behind the wall, then it's game over. Instead of immediately booting you back to the main menu, the game teases you with a little cutscene, making you think you might be able to get out.
Game over.
At the end of each level you are given bouncer points to pay for health upgrades, strength upgrades and additional attacks, but I only ended up buying one of these additional attacks because I found my health being drained by most of the enemies in the game and got fed up redoing the same boring level over and over again. The game also controls like you're wading through treacle. While you're in a 3D plane, the combination of the appalling game camera and the control make you feel like you're stuck on a semi-2D plane, almost like the Tekken Force mode in Tekken 3, only this isn't nearly as good. The back of the game box says play the action movie, and it's pretty obvious that the game was designed to show off the brand new PS2's technical capability. I remember this came out around the same time that the Final Fantasy Spirits Within movie came out. Both suffer from the same problem. They are both very pretty with nonsensical stories and pacing. Now back to the story. I must admit at this point that I found the earlier story summaries nearly impossible to write from just observing the cutscenes alone, as it really is a complete mess. After researching online to actually make a little bit of sense of it, it turns out there are actually diverging story paths depending on which character you play as, which makes some of the gaping plot holes kind of make sense. Yeah, that's pretty reaching, as the other 2 storylines hint that the Panther is someone Sion used to know, and also explains who the lady with the massive laptop in the opening scene was. Even with a little bit more explanation, the game makes about as much sense as extreme underwater chess, and I didn't feel any drive to replay it myself to see the extra content. In conclusion, it's very hard for me to hate this game, as something tells me that the dev team were given a bit more time to polish it, it may have been more enjoyable. It was also a very early 3D action game. The character designs are great, up there with Testuya Nomuras' best, and the presentation of the game with the multiple cinematic angles and graphics still look pretty impressive over 20 years later. This doesn't excuse the nonsensical plot, the boring as sin gameplay, the terrible game camera, or the lack of immediate retries though. So as a final word, I don't think it's really worth revisiting. Thanks for watching, and let me know what you think of the game in the comments below. See you later.